I was born in Halifax, and I worked most of my life as a photographer, and I have a day job now at Canada Post, but I still have this passion for collecting early Chinese history in the Maritimes for the last 22 years. When a grandfather arrived, he set up a couple of small businesses. The first one was like a grocery store, a dry goods store on Granville Street near the corner of Salter Street, where there's a parkade there now, which is kind of interesting because there's a Chinese grocery store presently across the street from there, and two other Chinese businesses like a bakery and a noodle shop. There were two or three other things like a men's hostel where all the men who arrived would stay there who got jobs that worked in the laundries and so on, because it was hard to rent to Chinese. So they had their own space, like where they could rent from and so on. And a laundry as well in that same block. Those two other places, like on Hollis Street there, where the New Asia is, and the Trident, a friend of mine who's Chinese Canadian from Montreal, she owns a Trident. And then you go up to Barrington and Inglis, and there was the Atlantic Grill where the Basha is, the Middle Eastern restaurant, and then the Boneheads. That was my father's grocery store at one time back in the late 30s. But there's a Dominion Cafe where the Chinese barbecue place is now. That was a Chinese restaurant back then. It was for quite a long time, probably from like the 30s right up to the late 50s, early 60s. It was a Chinese-owned restaurant. Yeah, and so there's still those pockets where, you know, they started out, and now over 100 years later, they've kind of like somehow have become Chinese-owned again with a newer generation. 2 generations later, I guess. 1952, there were 44 Chinese-owned restaurants in Halifax, but they didn't serve Chinese food. They served Western fare, and that's what made things very unique here in the Maritimes, and especially here in Halifax, because they weren't restricted like in the bigger cities like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and even Ottawa. There was the Chinatown ghettos where the Chinese had to stay in those areas and couldn't own properties or live or do business outside of the Chinatown. And so in the Maritimes, like the major cities like Halifax, Charlottetown, St. John, Moncton, Fredericton, they were all allowed to own businesses and live on the main thoroughfares, like near the train stations, because back in the 50s and 60s, the train was more popular because not everybody had cars. And like in Halifax, St. John, and Charlottetown, near the waterfront, where there's high traffic, like people coming off the ships and everything. So that was part of the reason for all that influx too, from those neighboring areas, like the villages in China, like the Hums, the Fongs, and the Lees, all came from the same general neighborhood, like near Guangzhou and Huiping.